economics course or studying economics in school or college, you are given a lot of functions, as they call them, mathematics. You are given a lot of graphs. Some of you may have been familiar with so-called supply and demand curves. You are given discussions of things called public policy. The concept of economics has evolved through, well, let's write down some names that are worthy of noting, if nothing else is worthy of noting in this world. The people who come up with the concepts that we currently live by and have built up. There are, I suppose it was originally spelled with a K back in Germany, the following people who have made great steps forward. And, of course, the greatest in some sense of them all. Beg your pardon?
That's real economics or Austrian economics.
That's where we're starting from. That's what I just said. And I will add a couple more as we go along. These are the names to conjure by. These are the great sorcerers whose magic we will summon here. And perhaps there's one new one going to be added. I'll just put them in for completeness. In a sense, since we're sitting in, we're dealing in kind of authoritarian or discipline mode here, which lends itself all too easily to argument from authority, let us stand by the following. These are the only people I consider authorities in the field of economics. So if you want to bring up other people or discuss other people or argue about other people, that's fine. If we want to simply say, well, let's agree on this and go on from here, these are the ones which I will do. Each of these people made, roughly in this order, important contributions, critical contributions to economics, in the same way that Albert Einstein and Erwin Schrödinger, perhaps Werner Heisenberg, made in theoretical chemistry or physics, depending on your point of view, which courses you took. In the beginning, there was, of course, people like Adam Smith. Smith had problems with the many of his basic concepts, but he was first in line, right? He came up with all sorts of interesting ideas, but he was highly elementary. In his thinking, he came up with an incredibly bad concept. He didn't know any better. He didn't know what to do with it. So let's go back here to in the beginnings, 1776. A year that you should conjure with in other areas. In the beginning, Adam Smith, following the concepts of natural law, which were developing at the time, in other words, he was looking at these things, at people acting around him as a scientist would. He was, as a scientist, was looking at particles bouncing around, atoms, and so forth. He was very early on in doing things this way. The French results were slightly ahead of him in this, but basically, from art, English, and so forth, going down, he started off that way. And he made many valuable contributions, and a lot of them were taught in basic economics and so forth. But he also had problems with a couple of items, which we're going to cover here, and which became problems henceforward. The reason I need to cover these is that if any of you, and at least a couple of you, have backgrounds or dealt with people who have an anarchist tradition in which they have severe problems with these things. There's good reason that they have it. Anarcho-communists, for example, are not perverse necessarily, or intransigent, or refuse to listen to reason. They have a tradition which comes about because Adam Smith, who was originally a moral philosopher. There was no such thing as economics when he invented it, of course. Just as today, one could say there's no such thing as counter-economists, certainly in the sense of teaching it. Adam Smith, in 1776, he came up with, among other things, the theory of moral sentiments, and the theory inquiring into the problems and so forth of the world of nations. And with that, economics was declared, and he came up with the following concepts. Now, I didn't go into adjectives on these two, but essentially all three of these are wrong. This was Adam Smith's beginning, and this is where he went wrong. In the labor theory of value, the problem was this. Again, like thinking like a scientist, you're trying to always break things down and look to the fundamentals, what's causing anything else. You know, if you're a chemist, you try to get down to the atoms, and if you want the atoms, you want to know how the atoms and particles interact, electrons, and so forth. So he wanted to know what's the basic unit or the basic material of value. Human beings are exchanging things. They exchange, that's the first basic economics. They trade material goods and immaterial goods, as it turns out, as well. And they value them. There is a reason that I want something from you and you want something from me. It's a form of valuation. Where does this value come from? Is there some common denominator that we can perceive in this? Well, Smith thought he could, and others who followed him came up with the idea that the amount of work that went into producing something was a fixed amount, something fixed and basic, and could therefore be utilized to ascribe value. If you can figure out how much work went in, maybe fiddle with a couple of minor parameters, you can figure out how much anything is worth. Now, in issues of these other things, an interest in rent, he also did not have a strong or credible concept in here. He also had a little problem with the concept of profit, which all of these are going to tie in a minute to the Austrians. They are, in my opinion, their great value is that they solved all these problems. They put them on a true scientific basis, and in fact, what I consider the science of economics or praxeology, which Mises uses the term, begins with Menger and not before. What existed before that was a descriptive attempt, something like biology is today, where in fact they don't know what's really going on. They don't know the basic atomic structure as they do in physics and chemistry. They simply take a lot of notes and observations of what goes on and go on from there. Okay, so Smith came up with a bunch of ideas. In these particular areas, he was wrong. In a lot of other areas, I'm not even going to waste time on here. He was incredibly right. He was very good on things like the laws of comparative advantage, the laws of absolute advantage, as I recall when I was first coming across this stuff. Why people trade, what's the value of free trade, why any attempts to get in the way of free trade are counterproductive and end up with net losses to one or both, and the summation of exchanges will also be a net loss. All sorts of things like that Smith was good on, and all the ones who followed him were Ricardo and up until modern times. These remained a sticky problem, however, and there began to become divisions in the 19th century over how to solve them and what kind of things to ascribe to value and how to deal with interest, rent, and profit. We also got little side trips with Malthus and his geometric versus
arithmetic.
Mathematic and linear, and basically the two curves of the straight line growth or linear growth versus a hyperbolic, or as he called it, a geometric from the geometric series concept. And as you can see, the food is never going to go as fast as the people, according to him. Of course, there's nothing to say that if you increase the total. These were all based on assumptions, such as that there was a fixed amount of land, and at the time it seemed like maybe there was. In the 19th century, we had colonized much of the planet, and while there was still a lot of expansion going on, they felt that would have to end eventually, and that would be the end of it. Nowadays, we more enlightened people, I think, I have this view that we can continue expanding land indefinitely out through space, terraforming planets, building L5 colonies, and so forth. And therefore, this line here, the base of it can be raised up indefinitely according to the land amount. The problem with land also led other people into strange territory. Rent, in particular, led the Henry Georgists, the followers of Henry George, off into weird directions. The problems with interest and what it means and where it comes from led in the 1920s to Major Clifford Hughes Douglas and the social credit movement, attempting to solve what they thought they had a solution to, and then attempting to win the people over to that and end the great banker conspiracy, which in fact does exist, but that's either here or there. Their economic understanding of why it was wrong. And the concept of profit led a guy named Karl Marx off into an interesting direction, because he couldn't figure out, as did Smith, exactly what profit was and why it should exist. Okay, so this is the sort of where it all comes from. Around the turn of the century, around 1900 or a little before, there was also a whole other school that came up, which we may or may not have to deal with. A guy named Irving Fisher and a guy named Marshall and a few others, who eventually led to their economic descendants, Milton Friedman and the so-called Chicago School. They went off on a whole other line of deviation, differences. What Menger came up with was a solution to the key one here that began all this. Menger came up with a concept which is absolutely critical to the understanding of all economics, and that we all of you are now familiar with, of course. and that is the theory of subjective value. Once you've got this premise, you don't have this premise, or if you reject this premise, then much of everything else we're going to deal with will not follow. If you do have this premise, then I think you'll pretty well be able to figure out as we go along why we're doing what we're doing and how things evolve the way they do. Subjective value theory simply says that you and I value things differently according to what individually we are. We do it totally subjectively. There is no objective base for our ascribing a value to this. If I want to exchange this book and one of you has a notebook and we're looking and deciding, well, should I keep this book, should you keep your notebook, or should we make a trade, we are going to sit here and make a rapid series of calculations, almost at this point instantaneous. You'll look at your notebook and say, well, I value it less than this book. I will look at it and I'll say, I value your notebook less than this book too. Therefore, you are willing to offer your notebook for this book, which you value more for, but I am not willing to offer this book, which I value more than your notebook, for your notebook, which is to me less value. No trade occurs. On the other hand, if I have 4 or 5 of these books, and I look at this particular one here, and I look at your notebook, which I don't have one of, I may decide that I like that notebook, in this particular case, I like that notebook better than this book. You like this book better than the notebook. We trade, and both of us have satisfied subjective value. If there was such a thing as objective or intrinsic value, which many people postulated, then these trades could never happen. Somebody would always lose in every trade. There are people who have this sort of negative sum theory of economics, and they have developed some interesting theories, but all of them, strangely enough, have a large proportion of what's called exploitation concept in their theory. Somebody's being exploited, somebody's being ripped off. Okay, so that's the subjective value theory, and of course what it does is it answers this. Labor theory is wrong. Labor can be totally wasted. Labor is not in itself a value. It may be, in fact, to the laborer, as people like this have pointed out, the labor itself is a disvalue. Something nobody wants to labor for nothing. The joy of the worker leaping up in the morning and rushing off to satisfy himself with 8 hours of strenuous effort doesn't exist. Even Stakhanov, the great Russian worker that was supposedly great on this, undoubtedly had psychological motives above and beyond the performance of the simple acts that he was supposedly doing in the assembly line. Undoubtedly, maybe he likes hero of the Soviet Union medallions weighing him down wherever they were pinned. But as far as labor, the fact that labor has any intrinsic value is ridiculous. Simple examples that Balvay and others come up with is, what about buggy whips? In 1901 or something, or in fact, you probably have to go back to like 1861 at this point. A buggy whip had value. And a nice, well-crafted one you spent a lot of work on, had even more value. But even a simple one that you could just toss off an assembly line had a certain people go out and pay money for it, or trade or barter, whatever was necessary. But in come 1910, you couldn't give them away. Everybody was going around in cars, right? The Model Ts and so forth. Buggy whips plummeted down. The same amount of work went in. As far as we know, there were no great advances in the production modes of making buggy whips. Yet the desired value for them is gone. Now, of course, the reason I had to cut it off in 1910 is that nowadays there are so few of them left that they would become collector's items. But if they did, let us say they did. Now that the buggy whips, which we're waiting for, we'll equal out the dollars, because that's a whole other issue to talk about the exchange and inflation here. But in fact, what would happen is that the buggy whip, which in say 1980s dollars would be might have sold for $10 a buggy whip in 1870. Went down to fire sale levels at 10 cents a piece for in boxes of 100 if they could get rid of them in 1910. Today, if you found one, you might in fact be paying $50, $49.95 for this antique item to hang over your mantelpiece, or maybe even $99.95 or whatever. If it was a handcrafted one, and they could apply a name to an artist on it, maybe even a few $100s. So in all those cases, exactly the same labor went in, but the valuation has changed drastically. Where did the value change? It's the only place it could have been the subjective value of the consumer, the person wanting it. And so, there goes labor. Out the window. You want to have a question before I go into interest?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what the normal Marxist or labor theory of value person responds to that example.
Well, those of us who've been in sciences, and I include computer sciences and mathematics, are well aware that when a theory begins to leak, you start putting on ever more intricate patches. There becomes sort of a negative labor theory of theories here, where the more the theory begins to fall apart, the lower its value, the more labor you pump in to try to keep it afloat. And the case of Marxism, and of course some of the modern Marxists are really fun to talk to because their level of patchwork has that of a 17th century quilt artist of medieval France or something. In order to make these things work, because what they do is they constantly add on more correction factors. If you put in enough correction factors, everything will work. They talk about various forms of labor. For example, what's capital? They have to deal with that immediately. Capital, to a Marxist, is frozen labor. So now we've got different temperatures of well-chilled labor. and we go on at this level. I mean, it gets quite hairy. They talk about the forms of the cross-border exchanges and so forth. It adds up to collectives and how it can be broken down, whether or not it wears out with time, and what's actual labor and what's wasted labor and what's kept in the product. And of course, if you make enough correction factors, it's like if you take a sum of 1 plus x, plus or minus, but 1 plus x squared plus x, with fudge factors a, b, c, etc. You can make it fit any function, including whatever. I don't know if you guys are familiar with enough math what I'm talking about, but you can make it come up with something like e to the x, as long as you go to infinity, and as long as you keep adding more and more correction factors in case of mathematical proof. So in a sense, modern Marxists are sort of approaching it. Well, what are they approaching? What are they using when a mathematician uses this kind of thing, or a chemist, or a science, or people in computer science? Right, I don't remember where we were. Keep on going from there. Labor theory value, Adam Smith, Carl Menger, objective theory value, bam, gone. Moving on.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What's this banker conspiracy you're referring to in connection with was it interest or marriage or something?
Well, there is. That's an entire interesting topic in what I would call revisionist history. That is to say, historically, there have been people who have gained by the fact that governments can control the money supply by use of sufficient force, and by doing so, this will get to be more interested in counter-economics in some areas, but by doing so, they can manipulate the rate at which money is exchanged, which has some bearing on the interest rate. We'll be about to get to that. And therefore can make appropriate profits. Well, the word profit is incorrect there too, but we're going to get to a correct definition of profit in a minute. But can acquire money or value that they didn't otherwise have, and that they clearly wanted. Be very careful in our use of terms here until we define them. Okay, interest. What are these things? Okay, as it turns out, these three are groupable to some extent, except for profit is going to be broken down into two concepts. Let us, at this point, I guess I'm going to have to thank you, Carl Menger, and we'll move on. Oh, before I get into that, why don't I briefly take care of William Bumbavar. Bumbavar had a concept, several concepts, but the one that I particularly remember before is a concept called the capital pyramid. His idea was, and this has to do with things called factors of production, but basically, if you want to make something and then sell it, you first got to deal with the tools. In fact, even after you make it and the tools, nowadays you have to worry about things like distribution. If I make a product, how do I get it to the person who wants it? So there's a whole series until we get to the final end, so to speak, of the end product. There's all these layers that have to be of steps of production. And each of them requires investment and therefore capital. So you get what's called a capital pyramid. This sounds incredibly obvious. In fact, there's a sort of simplified version of this in most economics texts when they talk about capital and factors in production. But the thing about Bumbavar is that he put it into this particular form in which when investment, the way he talks about it, basically, say if you add money into the system, you can see it'll flow up the capital pyramid, and actually, in a sense, the way I've got it here is kind of upside down. It goes generally the other way, but it doesn't matter. As the money goes in, it tends to build up more and more layers on top, and therefore you will have ever longer periods of production. Some of the stuff is not going to be immediately relevant to you, so it's only going to come up if you want to argue about some of the finer points. But this is why Bumbavar is important, and in fact, this whole concept of capital and interest, as the book was called, leads directly into von Mises, and it's still an incredibly valuable concept today in most economics, and was not in existence before Austrian.
Is he the source of the idea that the more a laborer has tools to increase his productivity, the higher the standard of living of the laborer and everyone?
Not really. It's not. I mean, it does come out that way, but it's not obvious from the from his.
Did he start forward with that idea?
No, not that particular idea.
Or that came from what they later determined?
Perhaps it's not. It's not an obvious statement. Just because somebody has more tools does not mean they have a higher standard of living. They might be operating inefficiently. Anyways, Mises is where most of this modern stuff, which we're about to get to, comes in. And with Mises, who accepts the subjective value theory of Wenger and the capital pyramid and so forth, the capital structure of as mapped out by Monmouth, Mises gives us the key issue which solves the rest of these problems. Where it comes from is can be approached several ways. One way is thinking in terms of the future versus the present. And the other way is what's called, or almost the same thing, something called time preference. Okay, what does this mean? Real quick. Time preference is simply this. If all other things being equal, a term which Murray Rothbard loves to use the Latin version of, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, if I have a choice of having $1 now or $1 next week, I'll take the $1 now. Okay? All other things being equal. I mean, that includes savings, how easy it is to carry it around, whether or not somebody's outside the door ready to mug you, and and so forth and so on. Assuming that none of that enters into the picture, would you rather have $1 now that you can go spend or not spend as you choose, have the freedom to do so, or would you wait a week and get the $1 later, or even for that week of time you would have absolutely no control over that $1 and be able to use it? I use $1, it's the same thing with a book or anything else. It is true that in very limited circumstances, that is, that circumstances mean that all other things are not equal, that in fact you might want to defer accepting something. For example, you might want to save because at a certain point of time you find it most convenient to travel, or you like the season of the year, you want to go there and so forth. That's an additional factor. That is not ceteris paribus. Okay, so that would be yet another value that you're acquiring. As Murray Rothbard says, the ultimate value is if you want a Coca-Cola, you want a Coke trickling down your throat right now. Anything else than that is additional factors of production. If your Coke is over here and you're over here, it's not trickling down your throat. You have to get it from over there to over here and then trickle it. If the Coke is in a machine out there, you've got to go to that machine or send somebody out to get it. There's another cost of production. If you don't know that Coca-Cola exists, but you just have the vague concept that you want something cold and high caffeine and high sugar load and phosphoric acid trickling out of your throat, the information cost doesn't get involved. You have to get that too. So these are all the factors that can enter into it.
So could you redefine time preference as just saying value is not fixed with respect to time?
No, time is the fact is time preference itself. What I was bringing in was all the other factors. Given all those factors equal, given in exactly similar set of circumstances, people want something now rather than later. This is the universal. There are few. Austrian economics has few universals, and they're powerful ones. Another one, which is one of my favorite, is the equivalent of the principle of least human action, which is to say that people always attempt to do as little as possible to accomplish their end. They like to put out as little effort as they can. Again, all other things being equal. Some paths might create great associations, or maybe you'll run into more attractive members of the opposite sex, and therefore you'll go a long way around. But that's not all other things being equal. That's another value being satisfied, you see? Okay. But again, all other things being equal, people want something now rather than later. Present money, in particular, money being a unit of value, as we're going to be using it, is always value over future money. Well, let's take a very brief side trip into money here. What is money? Okay, almost all of you kind of heard this from your pre-libertarian days, conservative days, even probably when you ran into somebody who whipped out $1 and said, "There's the Illuminati on it," and went away on a big long lecture from there on. What is money? It's a valid. Okay, the basic concept is it is a medium of exchange. Exchange is what economics is all about. You got something, I got something, we trade. We've already gone through that. But how many of these books do you want for how many of those notebooks? Now we get complicated. We need to have some way of figuring out how to make this exchange. How do we divide it up? How do we make unit? What's a basic unit? Something fundamental. Well, it turns out in the marketplace, another concept that I should probably define independently here. Marketplace, as I use it, is simply the sum of human action, all people exchanging all exchanges being committed by voluntary human actors, in some cases involuntary too. The Austrians attempt to not distinguish, although they do smuggle their ethics in eventually. Money then is what we're going to simply use it as a medium of exchange. There are all sorts of money once you take it a broad definition, and then you get into fiat money, hard money, and M1, M2, M3, and all the Chicago school fantasies. What we're going to use here, if unless otherwise specified, we'll assume that it is a spontaneously generated market commodity that everybody in the marketplace is willing to accept, and in the sense of at least exchanging it for something else which they'll accept, and find it readily easy to do so. Gold often has evolved spontaneously through history. It is not absolutely essential to the basics of economics that gold be the money, but interestingly enough, historically, it always turns out that it is. I think the elemental properties of gold happen to fit the concept the best, and until we synthesize something else that will, in fact, the very fact that we can synthesize it's probably going to rule against it. We're going to probably be highly goal-oriented. Okay, we have a medium of exchange. Again, it doesn't have to be medium exchange in the sense that could be you want grain delivery, you want a pile of metal for working on something, you want a herd of horses to go out and range and round up your cattle or something. Whatever it is, you'd rather have it now than later. Again, all of the things being equal. Well, what is the difference between these two? If we take a present money and it's worth more, and we subtract the future money, which we're discounting. What is future money? Now, this is a term that you get, that sounds kind of science fiction. Future money is simply a promise to pay, really, and how much you trusted. It doesn't exist now. In the future isn't here. This is not the future, right? It doesn't exist. We have an existential problem here. So unless you want to retreat into Sartre, you will simply make an assumption that this is some sort of promissory thing, which in the past you've had a good record and so forth. You're not a large presence in the libertarian movement, and find that it doesn't pay, in which case you'd have a very low value present. Future money and the difference would be quite high. If, on the other hand, you're dealing with somebody and you think that they're very likely to pay, this future money is going to be pretty close to present money, or sure, it's very close. Let us say, this is where we really get to the nitty-gritty of what Mises and those did. Let's say there's a 100% chance. Let us say you're sure that you're going to be paid 1 week from now or 1 year from now $100. You still would rather have the $100 to use all this coming year. There's still a difference. That future money is still worth less. You can't do things with it. You can't have that control. You can't not buy it or buy it as you figure. You can't have to wait that year until future money is in your hand. With 100% security, there's still a difference. That difference is always greater than zero. And the name we give to it, or the name that Mises gave to it, is originary interest. Not a very great name, but originary interest. And this is what time preference generates. Time preference generates something called originary interest. Well, what is interest itself? Is interest just that? No. It's a little more to it than that. However, it also has, before we even get into those things, we will notice that there's a connection between these two right now. Rent and profit. What is rent? Well, it turns out rent is exactly the same as originary interest. All it is specifically applied to land rather than money. We have present land, land sub present, versus land sub future. So what does that mean? Well, present land, I own land. Okay, everybody around me except that I am the owner of this land. That's our hypothesis. Now, I can keep it, I can do all sorts of things with it, I can play with it, I can build trees in it, I can set up a Agorist institute in it, there are all sorts of things I can do or not do. I can sit there and let it fly fallow and contemplate land and its greatness. Whatever I want to do, it's mine, it's my subjective value. Danny comes along here and says, I want the land. I've got a use for it. I'll pay you for it. What should I charge him? Well, I don't know. Let's see. How long are you going to have it, and are you going to use it? I'm not going to, let's say I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm only going to give it to you for a certain length of time, and you're going to return it. Okay, a year from now, I get the land back. Therefore, my present land is suddenly converted to future land. It's land that I will have a year from now, but it's not land that I have right now. Oh my God, there is a difference. For that year, I cannot build a trees on it, or build an Agorist institute on it, or commit all sorts of immoral or fun, naughty acts on it, right? Therefore, I've lost value. My subjective value is gone. What do I do? Well, once again, we're exactly in the same position as money. There's a difference. The difference is always greater than zero. And the thing is exactly, it turns out, the same as originary interest. There's a good reason for it. The name, however, that it should be given is rent. And that's where rent comes from, and that's why rent exists. It is not a plot of the evil landlord conspiracy. It actually would exist on a totally free market. As you see, we've made no assumptions of government, we've made no assumptions of the state, we've made no assumptions of intervention in the marketplace. We just had a bunch of people sitting around saying, I have some land, I don't want to use it, let's trade. And that's all that happened. Rent exists, yes.
What do you say to the people that will point out that you're making psychological assumptions about human beings?
The psychological assumptions, in fact, are covered in particular Mises' Human Action, because he goes right back to the beginning. He doesn't delve in psychology in the sense of any great depth, okay? What he does is he makes certain basic assumptions from the nature of human beings. Now, people can act contrary to nature. Remember, all this is subjective values, so therefore one can have values which are irrational, immaterial, counterproductive, self-destructive. There are all sorts of people self-destructing all around you constantly, right? I don't know what the suicide rate is out here, but it's pretty high. In fact, people who are in college, we happen to be in a sort of college setting, have a very high suicide rate, it seems. So, fortunately, there are no exams in this course, so therefore I don't think any of you will be dropping out by that particular mechanism. So that's, in a sense, the answer. What I'm saying is it doesn't matter what your theory, what your psychology is. If your psychology is, how shall we say it, such that you would want to give away the land to Danny that you happen to own at that time and take a loss, generate a negative rent, what you're in fact saying is that you are getting a subjective value from this form of what I believe the psychologists would call masochism. And in fact, that's a highly positive value to you. Just like going into a bar and getting a person of the opposite sex clad in the appropriate scanty amount of leather and taking out a big buggy whip, perhaps, and using it on you might be a value that you would in fact pay a lot of money for. And that's exactly the kind of value that would be involved here, where you would attempt to go counter to the laws of economics. One of the points, or one of the objective realities, remember, just because value is subjective doesn't mean anything else in here is. Okay? We can objectively see the results of your subjective value. You either made a trade or you didn't. I can see that. You know, that X was in your possession, that was in his possession, and therefore something is physically moved in reality. There's all sorts of objective consequences here. Some of our modern libertarian friends, allies, comrades, and travelers on the road to spiritual enlightenment have seemed to wandered off in this particular area. They go from subjective value to subjectivizing everything. It's sort of like beating a good idea more past its value, or beating it to death, or whatever. It doesn't apply. It's not true. Subjective value is exactly that, and it doesn't go any further. In fact, there are objective consequences to running in the opposite direction of where all these indications going. If you like to generate extra effort, if you want to put in more work than is necessary, you will probably quickly burn yourself out. If you attempt to always operate at losses in these particular areas, you'll quickly use up whatever you had, and you won't be in the market anymore. If you're renting out land at a loss, for example, you will soon find that you don't have any land anymore. Yeah.
What was the Smith was saying about things like interest and rent and profit?
Getting back into Adam Smithianism here. Smith did not have a good idea of why things work. He did not have a time preference concept. He knew that people lent money. Some ideas that Smith and some of the people immediately after him came up with as well. There was sort of a service charge involved, you know, and you had to kind of sit there and figure it out. And you know, there was accountancy involved and banking involved, and there were a lot of other areas we haven't even got into. Well, this is not the entire story of interest yet, and some of these bring in a little bit of statism as well. But so that those confused him. Those were additional things that have to be dealt with. But he did not have this basic original interest concept. If there were no service charges, which we're not even assuming here, they're so small we don't even think about it here. If there were no such thing as service charges, if there was no such thing as we'll get into a minute, as government manipulation of the money and ordinary risk factors, which would exist even without government, then, according to, as far as we can understand Smith, there would be zero interest. People would have money for nothing. And this is where the interest freaks, the money cranks, as they're called, like C.H. Douglas in Canada, and there are a bunch of them like Benjamin Butler in the United States, the Greenback Party, Free Silver, all of them came from that kind of concept. All these, the famous saying that we're all prisoners of some dead economist or other, you know, worshiping some dead economist, is incredible. There is no such thing. I cannot think of a political movement of the 19th, 20th century that does not come from economics. It does not come from economic fallacy or, hopefully in a few cases, economic truth. And they simply hadn't figured it out. You know, it takes time, and people have to think, and they hadn't got it straight yet, and people ran off in all directions. trying
Also
to.
true of profit, 10%.
Profit, we're going to get to in a second. Rent is very much the same. Now, profit, I have to deal with slightly separately. What happens is the term is used in so many ways that I want to pin it down. This is another reason I'm covering Austrians here, is because I'm going to use terms specifically in an Austrian way. Interest is one of them. Profit's another one. These are used in an Austrian way. You will not find them used exactly that way, or even very closely that way in some Chicago economics books or basic textbooks, because they are smuggling in their own little concept. Another one is inflation, which we'll get to in a minute, but since you brought it up, these are all things I'm going to use in an Austrian sense and not in common usage. Common usage has problems. Common usage has contradictions built into it. And therefore, in my opinion, it's not a valuable way to learn, using terms that are contradictory. Okay, profit is the third one here. Profit is two things. Well, let's go back to interest for a minute. I want to finish this one off, and then I can get to profit a little more easier, because you can understand how you break these things down. This is all we're dealing with now is Mises. We're giving him his due. Let's give ourselves some more room. It turns out that interest, in fact, has three factors in the real world, and the real world, unfortunately, today is statist. First of all, we have an originary interest. Now, we know where that comes from, time preference. It's always going to be there. Even with 100% surety in the future, we still got our values, and they're still going to get in the way. Now, we also have, and we will have in the marketplace until perfection is achieved, and until we have reached, C.S. Lewis is further and further in, and even then, the way he presents heaven, it may still exist. The factor known as risk, and this is extremely important to Austrian, because it's where entrepreneurship comes from, and it will tie in, as you'll see instantly, into the concept of profit. The risk factor of interest. How likely is this person that you are lending money to, or some commodity which you want to get paid back for, to pay you back? How many of you think anybody is 100% risk? Even if you were not a large presence in the libertarian movement. Obviously, he would assign to a libertarian the risk factor. This would be somewhere around maybe, 20% or so or less, right? Others of us, trusting types like myself, perhaps might figure 95%. I mean, God, lightning bolt might strike you. God might decide he doesn't like libertarians tomorrow. And maybe you won't make it across the street to pay me off, even though you have the money in your hand and you made it. So, we're talking about anywhere from 0 to 100. It's going to make a big percentage difference. Interest, by the way, is usually expressed in percentage terms. I think most of you have had even that basic level. Now, the third factor, and this one I'm going to have to hold off on dealing with in any depth, is, what should I call it this time? Well, what it is a factor that's put in for inflation. And it results from, the only way it can come about is by state interference in the money supply. Anything that it is technically possible, theoretically possible, if you were a Friedmanite right now, if you were James Friedman, you leap up in your chair and accusatorily point at me and says, but what about inflation? What happens if some private person decides to set up a money system and pump in all the extra paper? Wouldn't you be inflating? And the point is that, again, this is, of course, ultimately counter-economics, agorism of the real world, and Friedman constructs and hypotheses are occasionally interesting, might give us a little bit of enlightenment, but we're not going to get that philosophical. In the real world, such people are quickly driven out of the market, so that's your problem. You would lump them under the small category of charlatans, fast-buck artists, quick types and so forth, who just want to see what they can con you out of and move on from there. Some of these have managed to get government backing, however, and become somewhat permanent institutions, but that's of course not something we want. And in fact, that's where it becomes, as I say, government problem, and does. In the present state of society, and as long as we have a significant status presence in society, which I assume all of us are interested in getting rid of, this is going to be another factor. What is that? What does it look like when you're sitting there and actually calculating your money? Might as well do this right now, because one of the things I want to spend a lot of time with you is showing you how to calculate counter-economic things, so that you can do it in your day-to-day business effort. Well, so you can get in the Counter-Economics 100 course when that comes up. Okay, what you sit down and decide your interests, you're going to say, he wants to borrow $100 from me. I'm going to set that amount and think, okay, how long does he want for? A month. All right. What's it worth to me? Well, I've got $100 I can't spend, and boy, am I eager to spend it. He seems to be fairly eager too. Is he? Well, how eager is he? So we got to sit here. Well, the first thing, again, it's just like the books and the notebooks. I got to both sit here and compare subjective values. He knows what he's willing for that $100. He really wants that $100 for that month. He's willing to pay $200 for it. A month from now, he's going to give me $200 in future money. But he's not going to tell me that. He'd be a fool to work in that way. He would first try to find out how little I'm willing to part with it. Because if it turns out it's over 200, then there's no point. He can't afford it. He doesn't want it that badly, and so forth. Okay, so we're gonna bargain. Now, what am I thinking when he comes and asks me for 100? So he'll pay me extra. Well, I'm first interested in the loss of this, originary interest. The fact that my subjective values will be satisfied for a month. That might be kind of small. I might actually say, well, a month from now, I've got a lot of money flowing through. I can make it meet. I'm not really worry about it. $1 would probably suffice. $101 from now is probably the minimum that could actually get me over the edge. But how much of a risk is he? I look around. What's his track record? How many times do I think he's going to, pay off and not pay off? So now we add another factor in here for that. Well, it turns out I think he's a fairly good risk. He's paid off several times. So there's a slight chance he might not come through, say, 1 in 100. So I'll add $1 on for that. But we now exist in a system where we're dealing with dollars. So we somehow have managed to wander through the world without hearing about Argus transporters or coins of gold or whatever. So we ask ourselves, because we happen to be dealing with commodity, I ask myself, what's the likelihood of this $102 that he might pay me back being worth $102? And in fact, the inflation rate currently is going in such a quick case that I probably would want another $2 just for that. Of course, this is divided by, since we said a month, about a year, maybe somewhat, 24%. Yeah, actually 24% is not far off. So we'll say $2 in that. If it was a high hyperinflation German style 1923, then I'd want another 100 or 200 or maybe $1,000 in that, then. And if in fact it's one of the rare cases like England in 1815 when they tried to get back off from the Napoleonic War, tried to get back in gold, I might even have a negative inflation rate. The money might be worth $2 more a year from now as the trend continues. I'm looking at my calendar and deciding, and that conceivably could be a negative factor. The risk will never be. The surest you can be is 100%. So this will never be a negative factor. The originary interest, again, subjective value, unless you're strangely psychological and you're adding other values in here besides the normal ones, like self-destruction and so forth, this will always be positive. So these two will always be positive. Inflation conceivably could be negative. If the government, for some strange reason, once or twice in history it's happened, actually intervenes to the deflation, this could be negative. Now, we add all these three together. This forms the interest rate, and the interest rate is why money costs money. Profit, which we now finish this all off on. What does profit do? Profit comes from two factors, and I like to use it, again, the Austrian term, such that profit only applies to one of these two factors, and what these two are, or what is the equivalent of these two, is usually called, at least in the Austrian books that I've read, the rate of return on investment. Okay, if we break it down this way, now rate of return investment is exactly the same as the originary interest rate and exactly the same as rent. Given all factors equal, given risk equal, given the same people that you're dealing with in a free market or in a market that isn't being distorted by some sort of intervention, these will all be equal. So the interest rate is 5%. The originary interest rate is 5%. That's what everybody's time preferences adds up to, and it gets averaged out by all the rapid exchanges in the marketplace. If it's averaging out to, say, 5% for the time being, the rent, again, no other risks, every landlord trusts every tenant, every tenant trusts every landlord, and so forth, that'll be 5%. The rate of return on investment, what you're going to invest into a business, what you're going to buy tools for, what you're going to set up factories for. People put more of that. You're going to expect 5% return on all your investment, or you won't do it. You're going to say, if it turns out this is, for some reason today we got up and this was 4%, this was 6%, money would flow. People would drop out of factory efforts of investing in factories and would shift into interest. If it turns out land was going from 7%, money would flow. The people would shut down factories and go and invest in land. People would stop lending money at interest and would go off and begin to buy land with it.
Please turn the tape over and rewind to begin side 2. Thank you.